thank you once again so much for being here. I'm Christina, I'm the Early Career Scientist representative. This is Archita, she's on the ECS team. And today we are talking to Stefan Krause, who's a professor at the University of Birmingham in the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences. And he's a professor of Ecohydrology and Biogeochemistry, who works on a wide range of research topics that we're hoping to learn more about today. Archita, do you want to get started?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thanks, Stefan, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't we start with your professional journey? How did you end up choosing a career in teaching and research?
I was always quite interested in the outdoors and doing a lot of outdoorsy stuff, and being out in nature, you can't really prevent from asking yourself, how do things function, right? And that started as a child. I grew up by the sea. That meant that family holidays were often spent rather in the mountains. So I got fascinated by spending time in small, quite gravelly rivers, which were very different to what we had at home, where things were more agricultural and sandbed streams. And I found that really interesting, and maybe made first experiences with managing small rivers and nature-based solutions. I probably kept my options open with my studies. I studied geoecology, which is really a broad band of different geoscience, environmental science, ecology-related subjects, and then start to get really interested, actually initially in more soil sciences, then more and more hydrology and water sciences in the wider sense, and pursued a PhD in that topic, doing initially a lot of modeling, but then realized that what I really like is the interaction between being able to spend time developing models, numerical, mathematical models, spending time in the field, falsifying models with observations, but also increasingly spending then time in the lab and looking into more small-scale processes. Well, I took rather short postdoc after my PhD and realized that I have a lot of rather broad interests as well, and starting with an academic post relatively early on allowed me to pursue multiple of that avenues at the same time, working with early career researchers together, and yeah, have been going since.
Great. I understand you're working in ecohydrology and biogeochemistry. What are the key concepts do you think that the researchers should know, but there is not enough information out there?
It's really important to understand, and that's maybe for the people that work on environmental and human health. You see, with my field, where I'm working a lot on the interaction between hydrology and then disciplines for which hydrology matters. A lot of them are people working on environmental and human health. I think it's really important to understand that exposures that we are concerned about, exposures to contaminants, to pathogens, there are mechanisms that determine these exposures, that control these exposures. And hydrology, as one of the fields, can provide quite a lot of understanding of the mechanisms that control these exposures, that control what amount of pathogens or contaminants you are exposed to if you drink water. Similar to how meteorologists might be able to help us to understand what the exposures of the contaminants that we inhale are controlled by. I think for hydrologists, I think a key concept is to understand that where water flows and how long it takes along that pathway is something that matters not only for the water itself, but it controls a lot of non-physical processes. It controls the behavior of a lot of the contaminants, of really the biogeochemistry. So that's the biogeochemistry part in my job, as well as the ecology of the water. And I think I wish that sometimes as hydrologists, we would have a little bit wider views there. I think we are getting there, but it's slow.
I understand that contaminants not only is bad for us humans. Can you tell us something more about how hydrology actually influences the rest of the ecosystem?
We often take a very classic view, and I want to challenge that, perhaps a classic view that there is that the physical processes, hydrology and hydrological fluxes being one of them, affect, on the one hand side, the transport of energy and matter, and that defines how contaminants move from one part to another, how water is cooled or warmed, how the energy balance is basically determined. And that has consequences. That is right, for instance, for biogeochemical fluxes and biogeochemical turnover, just because you create opportunity for different reactants to meet in a reactive environment that's driven by hydrology, because it controls the residence time of different contaminants that have opportunity to meet. It controls reaction rates by controlling temperature. And that has impact Of course, on environmental conditions like habitat conditions, the temperature itself has as probably one of the key state variables. Flow velocity has significant impact, of course, on animals as well as plants living in aquatic environments. But then nutrient, the carbon, the contaminant loads, of course, have as well. And that's usually the way how our thought of chain is generated and how we also traditionally have been teaching it. And it's only in the last couple of years that we start in our group, for instance, working more and more also trying to think in the other direction and seeing how ecology is actually affecting hydrology and biogeochemistry as well. To give you one example, we have many species that are bioturbating. Chironomid larvae of this non-biting midges that can be really pesky and annoying, but they are pumping huge amounts of water through the streambed environment that we know is very reactive, or lake sediments, and have a significant impact on biogeochemical cycling, on the location of water, on temperature, etc. as well. So it's quite often, I mean, you could use some larger mammals like beavers would be a good example, right? As ecosystem engineers that are where basically ecology is controlling the flux of energy and matter, and with that also biogeochemistry. So I think we then need to see these interactions a bit more in a circular way, not just from the physical controlling biogeochemical and affecting the ecology.
Great. So it's not just that the hydrology has some impact on ecosystems, but also ecosystems are impacting the hydrological cycles, and there is this whole
Exactly.
feedback loop.
Exactly.
So why should general public be interested in this hydrological and ecosystem feedbacks?
Because it affects us all, right? Where if we are thinking of global environmental change and driven on the one hand side by significant land use changes, by global warming, but also by changing demands on water due to mass movement of people and conflict arising from that quite often, water concerns us all the time. That's maybe more on a large level. But even if you think on your doorsteps, I mean, we are affected by quantity and quality of our waters. You are affected by the flooding many of us have been experiencing over the last couple of weeks across Europe. We can't ignore that. And similarly, water pollution is an issue that affects us all the time, where we not just think about the water coming out of a tap, but also the water around us. To give you a very bad example for that, where I am right now in Britain, where we are turning the wheel a little bit backwards, and we had a significant amount of untreated sewage releases over the last couple of years, and that has been affecting bathing water quality. So it has literally been affecting people being able to leisurely enjoy water environments, whether it's rivers or beaches by the sea, and economic impacts on oyster productions, fish stocks, and so on. So yeah, it affects us all day, every day.
And in your experience, do you think the policymakers are paying enough attention on the whole feedback loop of water and people and ecosystem as a whole?
It's probably too generic to say, because that varies a lot between countries and even within countries. But I think we are very happy that as a community we are finding a stronger voice. And things like the UN Water Conference almost 2 years ago now was a good example for that, and we might need more of that. I'm very happy that, you know, as an International Association of Hydrological Sciences runs scientific decades. And I think they are really important. They can stimulate a lot of thought, but they also help with the perception of what hydrological scientists and hydrologists can contribute to society. And I think that's where we can hopefully bundle our individual voices through these kind of actions a little bit better. We have to probably be better to articulate what needs to be done there as well.
So you focus a lot on the biogeochemical cycles. Can you tell us if there is any emerging pressures on the natural cycles, for example, due to some emerging contaminants?
One thing our group here works on a lot is how traditional view of looking into individual pressures and their impacts on biogeochemical cycles is not necessarily adequate anymore, because very often, whether that is environmental or human health, they are under multiple pressures that are interacting at the same time. So these multi-stressor interactions are things that we are experiencing more and more frequently. And one thing that groups in terrestrial ecology have been working on for a much longer time is developing understanding how very strongly nonlinear behavior in system responses, so-called tipping points, can be reached much earlier quite often due to the interaction of multiple stressors than you would expect from an individual stressor. To give you an example, one way how we are looking into this is that we analyze, let's say, the ecotoxicological relevance of exposure to individual contaminants not just by quantifying their impact individually, but by looking into how multiple contaminants that are often occurring in parallel, what effect they are causing on the ecosystem, or how they are interacting with other stressors, for instance, increases in water temperature, reductions in water flow, so less dilution, for instance. And we see very interesting and often very nonlinear responses. For instance, if you look into how toxicity is changing with regards to exposure, for instance, to some emerging contaminants like engineered nanoparticles or microplastics, if water temperature is also reaching a certain critical threshold, often species dependent, of course.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question here? Because you mentioned engineered nanoparticles. That is not something that I've heard about before, but that sounds incredibly interesting. Can you say a few words about that?
So there's a broad range of nanoparticles that get engineered, that whether it's titanium dioxide, for instance, nanoparticles is what would have been used a lot in sun creams, right? In sun blockers, or think of silver nanoparticles that are used in textiles, like reducing the smelling of my running socks, for instance. There's a wide use, right, of engineered nanoparticles. There's for drug delivery, a lot of things. And they're really important. And nanosciences, I think, have been, or nanotechnologies have really been on the forefront for years, if not decade also, following principles of safe by design standards of these nanoparticles. But that involves, of course, looking into how do they behave in the environment. And I think in particular in the field of microplastics, micro nanoplastics, where I work much more, we can learn a lot from that nanotechnology community, and in particular the principles that they have been developing, not just the analytical ones, but even just the testing ones.
So those developments are parallel, microplastics and the nanoparticles?
It all relates to the field of material science. In contaminant hydrology, we would be looking into what is their impact if they end up in aquatic ecosystems. And in order to do that, we need to understand how they are transported and how they are transformed, which for nanoparticles, for instance, mean how they are developing, how they're ionized. For microplastics, it would mean how they are fragmented further while they're transported, or how they are leaching additives, and where we are sometimes more concerned of the additives that they can leach rather than the particles themselves.
I'm a groundwater specialist, and we are told that most of the time groundwater is capped by rocks, which prevent movement of bigger particles into the groundwater. Can you tell us more about how these microplastics are getting into the groundwater system then?
I would lie if I would pretend that we really understand that yet. I ended up working on microplastics because my main field of research is at the interface between groundwater, like you, and surface water. And we saw in a lot of streambed environments, so in the streambed sediments, low density plastics with a density so low that they should be floating. And the current understanding that they would mainly deposit by gravitational settling simply wouldn't apply. We shouldn't find them there, right? Well, there could have been biogenic activity that brought them down there, but we find large numbers of them. So we only recently were able to reveal that it's actually this hyporheic exchange, that vector forcing of surface water into streambed environments is pumping large amounts of microplastics directly into streambed environments as well. And that means they are stored there for longer than if they would have just settled by gravity and would have just sat there, but can be resuspended really quickly if flow just speeds up again, right? So that is one of the many potential impact pathways for hyporheic exchange if you then have further losing conditions. We see a lot of potential for transport, in particular through fractured rocks, right? If you are in karstic environments, we have finished a global program on microplastic in rivers. We are currently running one in groundwater, and we have not come across a single sample yet that was free of microplastics. So while we would anticipate that, of course, there's a significant transit zone between the surface and groundwater, that of course varies a lot, well, mainly based on bedrock geology, but also on groundwater depth, as well as of course the management of the aquifers. If an aquifer is intensively pumped and you are, for instance, just as an example, drawing in a lot of surface water from rivers, so you have another potential path there, right? Managed aquifer recharge is a risk, for instance, as well, if it is done by direct injection, or even if you use bank filtration, right? You can potentially increase microplastic concentrations. But it takes a long time to analyze individual samples for microplastics. That means the total number of samples that get analyzed are generally quite low. And what makes things worse is there are no real well-defined protocols of how you extract and sample microplastics, how you then extract them from the sample in the lab, how you purify, just basically how you get that little needle out of the haystack. And that means it's really difficult. I'd say it's impossible to compare a lot of the data that have been published globally so far.
For our listeners who may not particularly be familiar with laboratory analysis, why does it take such a long time to analyze microplastic samples?
Yeah, in contrast to many other contaminants where I think we have seen a very encouraging, I would say that's one of the most encouraging innovations in the field, that there was kind of a move from the lab to basically building labs on sensors, putting them out in the field, and instead of taking water samples back to the lab, bringing the lab to the field. So that allows to monitor for many solutes their behavior in situ. So that means in almost real time and at a really high frequency, often at many locations at the same time. Unfortunately, that's not possible for the analysis of many particles, not just micro and nanoplastics. The issue is that you always need a large enough sample to be representative. From rivers, we usually sample 50 to 100 liters at least, and that's not enough for a single sample, right? Or you can integrate over time, of course, and you need very accurate discharge measurements so that you know what volume of water you have actually sampled. And then you end up with a lot of things, some of them being microplastics, a lot of other stuff, and organic material in particular, but also minerals. And you bring that back to the lab, and there are two really crucial steps that are, on the one hand side, get rid of all the organic matter that's in the sample. It can be done by different digestion methods. There are many, many different ones, and it's you need to find the sweet spot between being aggressive enough to digest the organic matter that is there, but not so aggressive that you reduce the amount of synthetic polymer that you have in your particle, or your microplastic particle that you want to analyze. We figured out that happens quite a lot. And then it's a density separation. There's a fact that the density of plastics is quite different to many of the mineral sediments. You basically make them float and siphon them off. And this takes time, depending on the sample. I mean, if you do that, we work a lot in snow and ice. We work in groundwater surface. We work a lot with human tissue samples as well. And depending on how much organic matter you have there and how persistent that is, it takes a long time. And then the analysis of that particles to actually confirm what polymer is it, what are the additives in there, takes a lot of time. Like even the confirmation of a polymer, I would say you mainly manage something like 3 to 4 samples a day at the fastest if you have a really good pipeline running in your lab. That's after all the purification, after all the extraction, and it's purely the analytical analysis.
We know that it's not just the plastic itself, it can act as a vector for other things too. Can you say something more about these other things that can also pose a concern?
One thing I would be concerned more about is pathogens like enteric viruses, antimicrobial resistance.
Yeah.
If you think we get a lot of particles that come out of wastewater treatment plants, of microplastic and nanoplastic particles. However, most wastewater treatment plants in countries where you have some are quite efficient in holding particles back, easily 90% if they are well designed. But that 10% can still be a lot. And then in most setups, the sewage sludge of treatment plants is used as a fertilizer in agriculture. So while we up-concentrate a contaminant, we then redisperse it into the environment and actually directly into our food production systems. That's maybe not the most clever way of how dealing with that. The second reason why there's concern about them as a carriers, chemical content themselves are independent of the synthetic polymers. And in order to have the properties that we need them to have, plastics can contain variable but usually high amounts of very different additives. Bisphenols, like when you take a water bottle, you often see a sticker BPA-free, bisphenol A-free, or other phthalates, flame retardants that we need to have in there, right? If you have your Gore-Tex jacket on, you don't want that to go up in flames as if it catches fire immediately. But they can, of course, as plastics then break down and you get secondary microplastics that if they are transported in the environment, they can leach. And we're often more concerned about these additives because many of them are endocrine disrupting. So they mess around with our endocrine system. They can be in particular for inflammatory diseases. And a lot of that is actually the additives, not the particles themselves.
Is there any remediation recommendation of this problem now?
There are many that are proposed. I don't think there are many that I find very useful. The ones that you may hear of most and that gets a lot of media attention are cleanup operations, and whether that's the cleanup of the ocean gyres. I'm very skeptical about that. I think it needs to be done. So I'm by no means against that, but I think it's very important that we don't think this solves the problem. It's a quite Sisyphean task right at the back end of the problem. And I think there's a growing understanding in the contaminant hydrology community, definitely the plastic community, that we need to rather tackle the problem closer to the tap, basically, where we start emitting that contaminants into the environment. There's a lot of positive development, I think, when it comes to designing new materials. I think we need to be very cautious there as well, not to make mistakes that happen in the energy sector as well. You may have heard the term bioplastic, which doesn't mean it's biodegradable. It just means it's sourced from biological compounds. They are not necessarily or not at all less environmentally concerning. And of course, there can be competition for water and other resources when they are grown. There's a lot of research into biodegradable solutions. I personally think reduced consumption and reuse is a promising path forward if you consider that fast fashion is one of the main sources for plastic emissions. So I think as consumers, we have a lot of opportunity there as well.
I know you've been on editorial boards of a lot of reputed journals. Can you tell us some breakthroughs in water research in last 10 years? And where do you see the trend is going for the next 10 years?
Oh, I think there's always a lot of breakthroughs, and they are really exciting. Nevertheless, I'm also a strong believer that science is usually incremental, and that's okay. I think many of us will have seen, criticism by editors saying, "Oh, this is an incremental piece of work," and it's important that it's novel, right? But I think we should not shy away from sometimes making this really important smaller incremental steps as well. Just by everyone wanting to leapfrog into massive new steps. Nevertheless, I mentioned already. I think a real big innovation has been over the last decade at least, instead of thinking how we can sample things differently and analyze it then in the lab, to rather miniaturize, totally change or miniaturize analysis and sample things in situ. And that allows to really monitor the hot moments or the hot spots of pollutants in a much better way. That also involves that sensors that can monitor not just one, but contaminants, that they are networked with each other in more smarter ways than we have done that before. So which means we are not just generating more and more and more data, but also data at the time when it really matters, when they are of value. And that's where I know everyone is banging on in all fields massively about the rise of AI, but I really think that data sciences and AI can help us to better utilize these big data, but also define in what way we optimize these observations and being more economic. Economic often means even power supply, just in this ways, so that we get the best outcome of understanding from data that we are capturing. So I think that has been a massive technological push that has allowed other huge steps in improved understanding, in particular when it comes to not just being descriptive about, we see let's oversimplify that, a rainfall event causing a response in load or concentration of certain contaminants, but getting a better understanding of what are the potential sources of them and what conditions activate them or deplete them. That really drives a lot of the research that then happens more on the impact and ecotoxicology side, looking into dynamic mixtures of contaminants. None of that would have been possible if we would have not been able to first come up with evidence that mixtures are changing in the environment constantly.
Okay, fantastic. So if you were talking to a young researcher who wants to get started in contaminant hydrology, in ecohydrology, in this intersection that you're working on, what are the sort of big questions that young ECS can tackle? And what would your advice be for them?
Yeah, I'm not sure I feel really in the position of giving advice, but I'm also happy to throw in questions, and if you think of research questions, I'd see a huge amount of them in the field of what we call emerging contaminants, or what in ecotoxicology is often called novel entities. We still don't even know about many of the breakdown products or metabolites of new contaminants. So I think focusing on the environmental fate and transport of many of these contaminants, and not only how they are transported, but really how do they break down, how do they interact with each other, and what controls their interaction in different environments where really contaminants from different environments are mixing. Archita just mentioned she's working more on groundwater, and we know there are more groundwater-borne contaminants. There are contaminants that are much more persistent in surface waters. In the field where I like to work, when at that interface between groundwater and surface water, a lot of them meet, right? And we still very poorly understand how hydrology controls that opportunity of different contaminants meeting, both in time as well as in space. How important the heterogeneity of the subsurface, for instance, is for that. So I think that field is huge. Developing not just new field approaches, monitoring approaches, but also models that can very easily be adapted in their level of complexity to answer questions where you basically zoom into complexity based as it's needed. I think would be really useful. To more general piece of advice that I once received was, be generous with ideas. Of course, that comes with risks, right? And I think in particular as an early career researcher, you also need to be cautious. And you can afford much more generosity, and it's easier for me to say that. But I was able to have fantastic collaborations following that advice, and be generous with ideas. So share ideas. Of course, be cautious that you get credit for your ideas if you work with people. But I think being cautious doesn't mean that you can't be generous with ideas as well.
The final questions that I still had. What is one of your favorite experiences, memories, or results that you've gotten recently in your research? Something that just really made your day, either in the lab or working with your collaborators?
I have many, but also because we did run experiments with large number of participants, where we brought many projects together to work on one field site, or where we did do larger model experiments. But the ones that I really think back to, and where I was surprised, and in particular where I was proven wrong, former PhD student that came up with wanting to run some model simulations. It's on hyperoic zone, how different temperature changes in the caused by hydropeaking of water that infiltrates the hyperoic zone, whether that could affect the flow in the porous matrix. And I was like, I can't imagine that that's really relevant enough to change the viscosity of water so much that this would have a measurable effect. And evidently it was just my imagination that wasn't enough. So her model, and then also some experiments, proved very well that this might well be an issue, and it's something that is worth further investigating. And that was a really nice way of being proven wrong by someone who you supervise and learn from at the same time.
Well, that basically rounds out our interview. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate having you on.
And what a great idea.
And
So I hope, in future your blog is becoming one of those where you can say, for people interested in the topic, that's what they should look at.
we really hope that's
Yes.
that's where we're heading. Thank you for your work, and I hope you have a
Yeah.
fantastic afternoon still.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.